going to be an extraordinary conversation for me. And I'm going to be honest with you. I'm a little nervous about getting it wrong because I learned so many amazing things in this stunning work. It is one of the most beautiful books I've ever read. Susan writes with, like some books are lyrical and poetic. This book is musical. It's written with so much love and emotion that I just absolutely fell in love with the deep, learned so much about it. So thank you for being here, and thank you for your extraordinary ability to make something so unknown tangible and bringing it to us.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, and thank you so much for coming. I'm really looking forward to speaking about this. I always think of anything I'm writing about as like I'm a curious person who goes out and finds cool things, and then I feel like a 10-year-old kid in a treehouse, and just wanting to call other curious people into the treehouse to say, look at this. I mean, look what this is. Can you believe we didn't know about this? So
it's a total call to the curious, and it's such a cast of characters in this book who are all drawn by the same thing, this curiosity to the deep, this thing we don't understand. Speaking of 10 years old, so you grew up in Toronto, nowhere near the deep,
right,
as it were. And you didn't even start swimming till you were 10, is that true?
That's true, but by the time I was 14, I was competing at the national championships. So it was a question of just diving in, and I was always completely obsessed with water. And we had a summer place on a lake. Canada's full of lakes, and north of Toronto, there are these lakes that are very dark. The water's very dark. And I would just sit for hours and hours and hours on the dock and hope to see a fish. But I was, at the same time, fascinated and terrified of them. So I think my swimming career was a little bit late in getting started because it was just a question of, I was scared.
Speaking of fear, on page 4, which I should have marked it in advance, I think I want you to read it. There's this piece where you talk about astonishment, the emotions, starting here. Do you want to read that for us? Starting with the inaccessibility.
Yeah, so before I read this, let me just sort of connect what I just said about these lakes, because obviously growing up in Canada, I didn't have access to the ocean, and yet these lakes, whenever I would see a fish, and there are some quite big lake fish in Canada. There were fish does anybody know a muskie? If there's anybody from the east, there were muskies. And every so often I would see something big, and it would just kind of come up from below. And it occurred to me really early on that there was like this parallel universe beneath the surface. And we couldn't see it because these waters they're not like some clear waters. They're like very dark and you can't see the bottom. And I just remember thinking anything could come up from there. And that was so compounded later in my life when I ended up at the Farallon Islands writing about the resident great white sharks there. The Farallons was that on massive steroids. So here was, this very dark, inscrutable water, and a great white shark would pop up, or a blue whale, or some kind of creature I'd never seen before. And that's when I really started thinking, this is a massive environment, massive. We think of the Earth as being a very large place, and it is often said that 70% of the planet is covered by ocean. But what gives you a better sense of just how immense the deep ocean is if you think of Earth as a 3-dimensional living space, a biosphere, 2% of that is land. Everything we see, everywhere we live, all of that, 2%. 98% is salt water, is ocean. And 95% of that 98% are waters below 600 feet, which is waters that scientists define as the deep ocean. So the fact that we don't know, we cross the surface, we see a little bit in the sunlight zone, a small fraction of the ocean, the ceiling of a room, right? A giant room. And I just always could never look at any body of water from Canada to the Farallons to beginning to work on this book and not wonder, what's down there? Yeah. And at this very moment, it's exciting because we are really the first people to ever have the technologies and the ability to find out. Mm-hmm. Jules Verne had to make it up.
And it's really only recent.
Totally recent. We are, like, if I had written this book 2 years earlier, it would have been obsolete almost immediately, because while I was reporting it in the beginning, there was, we can talk about this more specifically, but there was a vehicle invented that could go to full ocean depth safely, repeatedly, with a passenger, a pilot and a scientist, or a pilot and a journalist in my case. And that changed everything.
And what year was that?
That was 2019.
Incredible.
Yeah. So now I'll read this because I think I wanted to give it a little bit of context.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
But
you're welcome to start from anywhere
I'm just
want.
looking to see if it, but the inaccessibility of the deep, I thought, made it even more alluring. Others wanted to visit Paris, Bora Bora, the Serengeti. I wanted to go into the ocean's abyss. The idea of an unknown aquatic realm, ever present below us but invisible unless we look for it, an underworld within our world, had always worked a sort of spell on me, an alchemical mix of wonder and fear. It may seem as if those emotions would cancel each other out, but the opposite is true. When you add them together, you get the sublime, which transcends both. The passion caused by the great and sublime in nature is astonishment, wrote the 18th century philosopher Edmund Burke. And astonishment is the state of the soul in which all its motions are suspended with some degree of horror. But, he added, it was a sort of delightful horror. The abyss might be terrifying, but you wouldn't notice because you'd be too busy gaping in awe.
Yeah.
At least that's how I imagined it, and I wanted to see if I was right.
Isn't that beautiful? I read that a couple times. I was like, oh my God, this is, you just have this ability to like pull us in. But let's go back to the beginning, as you did in this book. Not too long ago, we knew nothing of the deep. We had no ability to go that deep, and people were starting to. So you bring us back to the history and the first pioneers, Aristotle I've learned quite a bit of Aristotle, Pliny the Elder, and people were afraid of the ocean, these monsters. And so take us back to the research you did to kind of give us a grounding in what we're discovering here.
Yeah, so I have the sense, I think it's a pretty good bet that as long as there have been humans gazing out over the ocean and maybe not being able to see any other land, just as far as the eye can perceive a horizon, and thinking, what is it? What's down there? Where does it go? How deep is it? And it's amazing how long that went on, with all kinds of wacky theories and beliefs. So I did try to trace it back early. I believe Aristotle's often called the first marine biologist because he did a lot of studying of marine creatures in a lagoon, and he did it in a kind of empirical way and learned a lot of things that, he was the first person that we know of to, for example, identify whales as mammals.
Yeah.
All kinds of things like that. He was doing science back then, but
pretty good science.
Really?
Actually.
Well, yeah. I mean, yes, absolutely. There was a lot of, like, Pliny the Elder was talking about myth and lore and superstition and all kinds of things. But Aristotle was like finding things, taking them apart, looking how they worked, making observations that turned out to be, in a lot of cases, extremely accurate. But I believe that there have probably been humans that are not in the Western canon or culture in ancient Oceania, certainly in in the Polynesia and Melanesia. There are oceanic peoples that were probably wondering about this and parsing it as best they could way before Aristotle. That's my personal guess.
How could they not?
How could they not? And these are ocean people, right? And so, but there was for a long time, the idea of what was in the deep ocean was pretty simple to wrap up in a single word, which was monsters.
Monsters, yeah.
So when you think of the old maps, and maybe they even have some replicas of them in this library, when they didn't know what was going on in any patch of remote ocean, they would just put, here be dragons or here be monsters. But in 1538, there was a map printed that was created by a Catholic priest and historian from Sweden named Olaus Magnus. It's called the Carta Marina. And if you've seen these drawings of what they perceived as sea monsters, you've probably seen the Carta Marina. It's very famous. And so I flew to Sweden to see an original copy of it. There are only 2 that we know of. And it's really big. It's like 23 square feet. And it's often when we see it, it's colorized, but the original was not colorized, and the colorized version kind of destroys it. The real version, in this huge, massive wall, it looks like he drew it with a pin. I mean, he worked on it for like 35 years, and Olaus's job was to travel around Northern Europe and Scandinavia collecting fees for the church, and he had a notebook, and he had a sketchbook, and he talked to people, and if you can imagine a 16th century medieval farmer from Norway who's walking along, comes upon a stranded sperm whale, a 50-foot long animal with 7-inch teeth and an eye the size of a hubcap. And, what is monster, it? There's no context. Of course it's a monster. So Olaus Magnus really took a lot of trouble to sort of categorize these monsters, and he gave them all names. And so in his map, once you get offshore, the North Atlantic is just kind of frothing with sea monsters. So for me, it was a good place to start, because along with being a cartography of Scandinavia, which was kind of an unknown part of the world at that time, it was a beginning of a cartography of perceptions about how humans considered the deep ocean. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's where it began. And then, the Enlightenment came along, and there were some instruments, and there was a more rational way of determining science. But that was really perplexing for the ocean, and particularly the deep ocean, because we weren't that far along with the instruments. Their sort of method was to take a weight, put it on a line, on a spool, and then let it go down to the seafloor and just kind of sense when it hit the bottom, and then wind it back up. And the winding it back up, the length of a man's arm is the measurement of a fathom. So that's how they would determine, okay, it's how many fathoms deep. Pretty rudimentary. Mm-hmm. But there were some incredible naturalists around the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries, 18th and 19th in particular. And they started sort of supposing that probably there was nothing down there.
Yeah, the azoic theory.
Yeah, that's right. And it lasted they called it the azoic theory, without life. And that theory lasted for a really long time. Like, it wasn't really completely dispelled till 1876. Yeah, and even though there were some people who were dropping weighted nets to to like depths way, the azoic theory basically said that anything below about 2,000 feet, there was nothing there. And there were people dropping trawl nets down to 12,000, 14,000 feet. And the ocean's deepest regions are, can be almost as much as 36,000 feet deep. And coming up with all kinds of animals. But some people hypothesized, some scientists hypothesized that the seafloor is probably sealed in ice. There was probably nothing there. And, probably because we couldn't live down there, and there's this crushing pressure, and they knew that because if they dropped any sort of item with a cavity in it, would come back imploded. Some scientists felt that it was probably the pressure was so intense that nothing could sink all the way down. Nothing was heavy enough to make it to the bottom. So everything that went down, ships, dead animals, humans that fell off of ships, were all kind of lost in space, floating through the midwaters. And all of this was dispelled 150 years ago.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is incredible.
It's incredible.
And the cast of characters who did that, Beebe, can you talk to us about him and his explorations?
So let me just back up to run into Beebe. there was the first deep sea expedition happened from 1873 to 1876. And it was a British expedition called the HMS Challenger that was, Queen Victoria funded it, a warship that was kitted out with science labs, and they went around the world for 3.5 years and proved, without a doubt, that there was life, really resplendent life, all the way to the bottom. And now we know that there's even a thriving biosphere miles beneath the seafloor, but enough to dispel the zoic theory. And so this was they brought back all of these data, and scientists from around the world, about 70 different deep sea scientists and various other disciplines, spent 20 more years writing a 50-volume set of, here's everything we know about the deep ocean. And it was extraordinary. And one of the things that had puzzled them was that a lot of the fish would come up glowing. They would have these sort of circular glowing, and they saw bioluminescence sometimes on the surface of the water. But they didn't know how any of these fish functioned, because when you bring a deep sea creature up to the surface, it really just kind of looks like a deflated balloon. Right. You can't tell much about it. But they were puzzled by a lot of these stranger looking creatures. So now we're at the beginning of the 20th century. And in 1930, the man that Jeniffer was talking about, William Beebe, he decided that he would be the first man to go into the deep ocean. And by the deep ocean, what he was really meant was the twilight zone, which is the uppermost layer of the deep ocean, and it goes from 600 feet down to about 3,300 feet. And I call it the Manhattan of the deep, because far from there being nothing living down there, there are more creatures in the twilight zone than in all the other regions of the ocean combined. And there are 3 much bigger realms below the twilight zone, but the twilight zone is just this happening place with quadrillions, literally quadrillions of animals in it, and 80% of them are bioluminescent. So thus the Manhattan of the deep, like it's just this blinking, flashing, throbbing, like every eat or be eaten nightclub of a place. And Beebe was the first man to see it. And he was a bit of a celebrity in the 1930s. He was one of the curators at the Bronx Zoo, which was brand new, and had gone all over the world to collect exotic animals for the zoo, and was very, very interested in the ocean, and was kind of a swashbuckling guy and a bit of a celebrity around New York City. And he also a very, like probably the most popular natural history writer of his era. So somebody at one point, Britain's Prince George just gave him an island in Bermuda and gave him a ship, as one does. And Beebe decided that he was going to explore a 2-mile cube of ocean in its entirety, survey it, like find out everything that lived from top to bottom. So he started trawling with nets, and he very quickly realized that all the creatures came up mangled beyond recognition. So he determined that he wanted to go. He wanted to go, and this was, of course, reported in the New York Times because he was such a celebrity. Like, Beebe is going to be the first man to explore the abyss. And there was another man who was an engineering student in New York named Otis Barton, who read this in the paper and was very disappointed because he wanted to be the first man to go into the abyss. But here's the famous William Beebe. But Otis Barton had one thing that Beebe didn't have, and that was a big trust fund. So, and also Beebe, I think he was a scientist and kind of a showman, and Barton was an engineer and could write checks. So he went to engage a naval architect, and they created this craft they called the bathysphere. And if you see this bathysphere, you just cannot believe that 2 6-foot-something men crawled into this. Right. It's just a steel ball with 5 feet in diameter. It has a hatch that's about 6 inches wide that they had to squeeze themselves through. It has 3 very small viewports, but they only ever used 2 of them because the only material that they had for a viewport was fused quartz, or a very strong glass. And when Barton ordered like 5 of them, and when they pressure tested them, they knew enough to know that they should pressure test them, but they didn't even pressure test them very hard, and 3 of them immediately cracked. So they had 2, the only 2 that survived the pressure test went on to the viewports, and the 3rd one was plugged with a metal cover. And the thing is, the idea of a viewport blowing out, which would of course never happen now, is so terrifying.
Totally.
Because nobody knew exactly what would happen. And this was a very heavy object, and it was going over the side of a ship on a long cable. So basically a 2/3 of a mile long steel cable, which also was very heavy. If anything happened on either end of that cable, they were on a straight shot to the bottom, and that's where they would remain. And they also, this is the part that it also cracks me up, is they had telephone wires running in through this cable. Yeah. And they were using bottled oxygen to breathe. And like if the sparks from the telephone wires in an oxygen, I mean, it's just like this when you read about Beebe. But they did 30 dives. They did 30 dives. In a couple of the dives, they sent the bathysphere down, and one of the windows did blow out, but nobody was in it. And on one occasion, the winch got they couldn't pull it up, but nobody was in it, and they fixed things. So I always kind of think of it as like a spin of life's roulette wheel for Beebe. But when they got down into the twilight zone, he just went berserk. He was a really beautiful writer. And he just saw these crazy, beautiful, glowing, twinkling, sinuous, gelatinous creatures. And so the telephone line was for him to, in the stream of consciousness riff, call up everything he was seeing to this. He had like this bevy of very attractive female like transcriptionists. And they all lived on this island in Bermuda. So that was William Beebe. But it left an astonishing record of what lived in the Twilight Zone. Yeah.
When did you know you needed to write this book?
I wanted to write this book when I went to the Farallones and saw that there was this massive party in the ocean that you could not see. But I also knew that I didn't know enough, and that it was the way that I approach a book is I immerse myself, and because I'm writing about the ocean, it's literal immersion. And I couldn't crack that one-way mirror. So I went off, but I just started thinking about it all the time and really like amassing information. And I'm very thankful that it was my fourth book, because it took absolutely everything that I learned about the ocean in order to be able to access the immensity of this. Not only there's 4 different layers of the deep ocean. There's the Twilight Zone that I just mentioned, the Midnight Zone, which is 1,000 meters to 3,000 meters, so 3,300 feet to about 10,000 feet. And then the Abyssal Zone, which is 3,000 meters to 6,000 meters, so 10,000 to 20,000 feet, give or take. And then below, that's the Abyss. The Abyss is the largest ecosystem on Earth. Below that is the Hadal Zone, which is from 6,000 meters to 11,000 meters, and that's named after Hades, the god of the underworld. And the Hadal Zone accounts for 45% of the depth of the ocean, but it only occurs in trenches where tectonic plates collide and one plate is subducting. So the Mariana Trench is one that people are familiar with, but there are about 37 Hadal trenches. So there are these extreme vertical environments. Like the Mariana Trench is 44 miles wide and 1,500 miles long. And so it's just, it's a very steep trench. And in each of those environments, there are biological sciences, geological sciences, biogeochemical sciences, and I wanted to understand the whole. And it's just a lot to bite off. I could not have done this as a second book or even a third book.
Or maybe anyone else. I feel like you were the person to write this book.
I definitely was obsessed. I mean, I do think that books require a certain degree of obsession because of the sheer volume of research, and particularly, of course, in nonfiction, and in a sort of a science adventure, travel, in pursuit of a story, I will go anywhere, do anything, read anything, go to any trouble. So.
As you will find out when you read this book. How long did it take you to do the research?
7 years.
Okay, which is really not bad if you think about it.
And my other books have all taken 5 years, and COVID was thrown in there, so and it really helps to find amazing. I always do look for really great characters, particularly scientists or others who are working and studying in this environment, sometimes interacting with it for other reasons, who are amazing guides.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let's start with Kirby.
Yeah.
He was an amazing guide who led you to your next guide. And it sort of happened that way, where one person would open a door to another. So kind of bring us through that.
So you're mentioning Terry Kirby. I was living on Maui, and I had heard through the grapevine that the University of Hawaii had two 2,000-meter manned subs. They were called the Pisces. And the chief pilot was a man named Terry Kirby, and we had mutual friends. So I went over to Oahu to talk to him, saw the subs, and was just immediately like taken by the sheer volume and the extraordinary content of the stories that he could tell. And so the Pisces could take a pilot and 2 scientists to 2,000 meters, which is really pretty good. There aren't that many subs that can go very deep. There are only about 5 subs that can go below 4,000 meters. There were 6 before the Titan imploded, but the Titan is a very extreme outlier. You can't even really call it a submersible. It's more like somebody's hobby that tragically killed people. But these subs are very, very, very much a feat of engineering. They have their own ships. They have their own crews of engineers. They're serious, serious business. So having access to 2,000-meter subs, and they weren't at the time accessible to dive because their mothership was being refitted. But one thing about submersibles that's different than submarines is they need a mothership. They have to be launched and recovered. And when they're below the surface, they carry weight that makes them negatively buoyant, and they go down, and then they drop some weights. The weights are usually steel bars, little looks like phone books, or steel pellets, but in any case, steel that biodegrades against the background of the ocean. And then they become neutral, and they cruise around for as long as the batteries will allow with thrusters, their propellers. And then when it's time to go up, they drop their major weight, and they're positively buoyant, and they are recovered at the surface. So I started to learn about submersibles. I had started to learn with Terry as my guide and a couple of his other pilots, and they had been working in the Pacific. And the Pacific is kind of my muse. And there are hundreds of thousands of submarine volcanoes. 75% of all volcanism on Earth is in the deep ocean. And Terry had been diving on active volcanoes all over the place. And these are not only geologically fascinating, but like biologically and microbially. And I would just sit there and listen rapt to his stories. And of course, they'd explored all the World War II shipwrecks too around Oahu, when there are a lot of them. And he had found a lot of them. So it was just story time. But at one point, it didn't look like the Pisces were going to go back in the water anytime soon. And I had already agreed to write the book. My publisher was excited about it. And I was still not sure, how am I going to get to dive in a submersible? You just can't buy a ticket to do it. But then, we're talking 2017. I heard that this company was going to build a 4,000-meter sub. And I called them up. They were called OceanGate. And I said, they didn't have it, the sub, but they were like, we're going to take people to the Titanic, and we're not only going to build a 4,000-meter sub, we're going to build a 6,000-meter sub, and we're revolutionizing this. And I said, well, that sounds really interesting. And then I went back to, this could be my ticket to get to, I don't want to go to the Titanic, but I want to go to 4,000 meters. So I get back to Hawaii, and I said to Terry, hey, I think I might dive in this OceanGate sub. And Terry just stopped in his tracks and said, and this was in 2017, you must never, ever set foot in that sub. Because Stockton Rush had come out to the University of Hawaii with his big plans and run them past various people and wanted the university to get involved. And it was from the start, like just a tragedy waiting to happen. So I started a file. Hoped I would never have to use it. Ended up writing about it for Vanity Fair in 2023.
So wow.
Yeah.
Now that wasn't in the book. You didn't tell us
because
that
the book was published by the time this happened.
Yeah.
The sub tragically was lost in it. Basically what happened to the sub was what absolutely everybody told him would happen to the sub.
Yeah, yeah.
And so Terry and various other characters in the book, at numerous stops along the way of my reporting, would say, like, nobody really thought he was actually going to do it.
Right.
Yeah, and we prayed he would, but he did. And yeah, and so the book came out in. Well, the incident happened in July. The book came out 2 weeks later, but it was printed in May. So so that's also why I wrote about it for Vanity Fair. Yeah.
There's a lot of things I want to ask you, and I realize we're coming up.
Yeah,
we're going to run out of time.
And that's the problem with the deep ocean.
There's so much to talk about and read. Let's start with how much the ocean gives to us, because I think that's such an important message in this book, is that it's our life force, and I don't think people are aware of that to the extent. So talk to us a little bit about how much we need our oceans.
Well, yes. I mean, think about what I said at the beginning is 95% of the biosphere, right? Mm-hmm. Like we know we live on an ocean planet, but we live also on a deep ocean planet. And the deep ocean, I'll speak about that just specifically right now, is the motherboard of the planet. Of course, it's 95, it runs the climate, it's the engine that runs the climate. It is responsible. We knew, up until very recently, we believed that 50% of the oxygen we knew that 50% of the oxygen we breathe is created by phytoplankton and plankton at the surface, respiring and photosynthesis. So the ocean is responsible for the fact that we can be here breathing oxygen. But now, just recently, they've discovered that there is also what they call dark oxygen. There are metallic elements on the bottom of the ocean that emit a small voltage and split water molecules into hydrogen and oxygen. So we're also, there's oxygen being created at the bottom of the ocean. And that's just a kind of a sense of how much we don't know, but every system that sustains us and keeps us alive, I guess, obviously there are elements like the sun and the atmosphere which keeps us from burning up, but the ocean has created the conditions for life to be habitable on Earth. It's where the carbon cycle is. It's where the nitrogen cycle mostly is. It's where 80% of the microbial biomass of Earth is. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how much you guys know about microbes, but the more I learn about them, the more I just am completely clear that microbes run everything. And so the ocean is this microbial repository. It is as I said, the sediments themselves are alive, and it's this data bank of genomic creativity that the Earth has basically archived in these living sediments. So there really isn't much that the ocean doesn't do for us. All these services, it is absorbing about 90% of our excess heat right now. We would be in real trouble if it stopped, but we don't know where that tipping point is. Right. It absorbs about 30% of our excess carbon dioxide, and the reason for that is pretty wild. It's very complicated, and I'll simplify. But all those quadrillions of tiny animals in the twilight zone, every night they swim up to the hundreds of feet to the surface and eat phytoplankton that has been, it's carbon because it's been nourished by the sun. And then they swim back down that same night. And when you're a fish this big, that's a long journey, and excrete that, or they're eaten by another animal, and that is then excreted. And in that way, they are cycling in a biological carbon pump, carbon out of the atmosphere and sequestering it in the seafloor. And these tiny creatures sequester the equivalent of America's total annual emissions.
Wow.
And it's the largest animal migration on Earth, and it happens every day. It's a vertical one. Yeah.
COVID-19, part of the vaccination came from the deep.
Yeah. So from an enzyme in a hydrothermal vent. And so hydrothermal vents are in the same way that when the plates collide, they subduct and they create these trenches. And that subducting plate is also where we get our major tsunamis, when the plates are battling and one slips. That's any earthquake over 8 has come from a subduction zone, and a lot of them, if they're vertical, will cause a big tsunami, like the Tokyo one or the Indonesian one. But on the other side of the plate, the plates are pulling apart, and they're moving in both directions, more or less at about the speed that your fingernails grow. And so when they pull apart, magma comes up from the mantle and creates new seafloor. And in the beginning, we only, by the way, kind of a major thing, we only discovered it in like 1977. People were like, well, then the Earth is getting a little bit bigger every year. Well, no, because on the other side of the plate, it's getting subducted. Yeah, so it's in perfect equilibrium. But on the new part, on the magma comes up, there are hydrothermal vents, and the hydrothermal vents basically gush out a mix of microbes and minerals and elements from the mantle. And again, in the 70s, we discovered that there was life had a completely new trick up its sleeve, didn't need the sunlight, didn't need photosynthesis. There were animals all over the deep ocean surviving instead on energy sources and minerals and microbes that were coming from below. So just like I said with oxygen, we've got this top-down source and a bottom-up source. Same with life. And I believe it's probably the same with everything in the ocean. But yeah, so these incredible creatures, they call it chemosynthesis as opposed to photosynthesis. Yeah.
And I mean, there's possibilities for cures for cancer and many diseases, and there's so much that we don't know about the deep. And yet, on the horizon, we're looking at the looming possibility of deep sea mining. Can you talk a little bit about that and how extraordinarily what a catastrophe that would be for our planet?
Yeah, well, one of the reasons why there is so much potential in these sediments is because these microbes, the ocean, for as many microbes as there are, and I think the word that I came up with after asking around was nonillions, which is like 10 to the 37th or something like that. There's even exponentially more viruses, and they're ancient. And so these microbes have all these different metabolisms and these different strategies for dealing with these being attacked by viruses. I mean, on scales that we can't even really imagine. And these are very novel ways to approach things. And they call it bioprospecting, and it's a very, very, very young science. And we're learning that there's this deep biosphere that goes even beneath the seafloor. So the seafloor that, let's just say 15,000 feet, because that is the abyssal zone. The hadal zone will go deeper, but most of the Earth is covered by waters in the abyssal zone. And when those waters hit the seabed, they form something called the abyssal plain, and it's very huge. It covers 54% of the Earth. There are massive geological features in there as well, like giant mountain ranges, all kinds of things.
You'd said like Mount Everest turned upside down in some cases.
Oh, dwarfed. And everything, it's just, once again, I think it's really hard for us to wrap our heads around how big it is. It's so immense. But so on the abyssal plain, there are these metallic orbs that form, and they're pretty widespread. And I wish I had a picture. There's pictures in the book. They look like little tiny cannonballs, but they're not just metal. They're composed of manganese, copper, cobalt, and nickel, but they aren't like lumps of metal. They're more like corals or trees because they're formed by microbes, and microorganisms live inside them. We don't know how microorganisms form them. We're kind of curious about that. They accrete these metals from the seawater at the rate of about like 1/10 of a millimeter every million years. So these things are completely ancient, and they then host an entire ecosystem on top of them because they're on this sediment plain, so they're a hard surface. So animals live all over them. Some of the oldest lived and most interesting animals on Earth live attached to these nodules. So since the 70s, like, this is the largest metal deposit on Earth, but it's in a realm that's very hard to get to, and now we know enough about the science of it to say, like, it's kind of the womb of the Earth. It's one of the most stable environments. The water is exceptionally clear. One scientist told me the only more stable environment is inside a cave. The abyssal zone, you can't call it completely pristine because we have plastic and nanoplastics, but we haven't been down there monkeying around. But deep sea mining is something that has been a glimmer in the corporate eye for decades. And it is not happening yet on any kind of industrial scale, but it's kind of on the verge of happening now. And it's probably more complicated than I want to get into about why. But let's just put it this way. There are companies in some countries, but the companies are the really bad actors, and they're hooked up with some of the small South Pacific nations that are really desperate, like in particular this nation called Nauru, which is 8 square miles. And these companies can't mine the seafloor without the sponsorship of a country that has signed the Treaty of the Law of the Sea. With Nauru's help, this one company called the Metals Company has forced this issue forward to the point where the entire world has gotten involved, and it's just a battle. And what they plan to do is destroy a 2 million square mile area between Mexico and Hawaii called the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. And it would be like clear cutting a forest, but taking the top 20 feet of topsoil too. They would take all of the nodules, all of the living sediments beneath them. And this is really not, this is dredging technology. It's going to cause a giant cloud that will kill every animal because the water is so clear. They've never evolved to dealing with any particulate. They will then shoot everything up a 3-mile pipe, and it's animal and mineral, right? Because it's everything that lives on the nodules. There's no plants in the deep ocean because there's no photosynthesis. So animals, minerals, up the pipe. They would then separate out the nodules and then blast everything else down and release it in a continuous fog at 1,200 meters, which is the area of the twilight zone and midnight zone where all of the animals communicate, hunt, mate, do everything with bioluminescence. So it's of all the things that we do that I don't like in the ocean, this just dwarfs. Yeah. But here's the good news, and I really think it is good news. I think it's too insane even for us. This is the biggest carbon sink. Scientists have banded together to say, look, we need at least 30 years more study because we don't know what we're even destroying. Yeah. And it's not going to grow back. When they're gone, they're gone. The microbial services that are happening. But the greatest thing that happened recently to prevent it from happening was that they realized that these nodules were actually the ones that are splitting the water molecules. So these nodules are creating oxygen. Yeah. Oxygen. Yeah. Yeah. And so that's a real stick in the spoke of these companies that want to rip them up. But it's just also, their idea is that we need nickel and cobalt for EV batteries, and for a greener future, let's destroy this the thing that's keeping us alive. And but now the battery chemistries are moving away from cobalt and nickel, so there really is no reason to do it.
So there's hope.
I actually think this is a battle that we will win, and I think it's a pass-fail test for humanity, and I feel very optimistic that we won't do it.
Nice.
Yeah.
I'm glad to hear you say that. I want you to tell everyone about your deep experience before we run out of time.
Okay.
And I wish we could talk about Victor. He's my favorite.
Well, I will mention Victor.
So
Victor is. I wanted to get into a submersible, and I got in nonfiction. You set out to write about a subject, a story, and then you go out reporting. And so there's a certain amount of serendipity involved, and who do you meet? What do they tell you? What do you find when you really look? And so I will come right out and say I think there's an element of luck involved. And this book, I got extremely lucky because as I was kind of sulking after being told I couldn't dive with Ocean Gate, I couldn't figure out anybody else I could dive with. The Pisces were out of the water. And I heard about an expedition that was going around the world to go to all the deepest places in every Hadal Trench. And I immediately started asking around and found some people that I knew through this is why I say it really took me all the books to be able to write this one, and got an introduction to the people that were doing this expedition. And it was all at the auspices of a man named Victor Vescovo, who's a very interesting character from Texas. And Victor is a guy who's made quite a bit of money, although he's not a billionaire. We kind of invite billionaires to spend their billions on ocean research because the government doesn't do it. It gives like $1 to ocean research for every dollar for ocean research. NASA gets 150. So there are a number of very wealthy individuals who have sponsored science expeditions and have their own ships and have their own subs and have their own robots. And it's as far as I'm concerned, all the better, more the merrier. Victor wanted to go to the deepest spots in the ocean because nobody had ever been to them. And he had been to the top of every mountain range, and he had skied to the North and South Pole, and he was looking around for something to do. And he is a very smart guy. He's almost like a Vulcan, kind of, but with like, he's not your average Texan. He's got a long blonde ponytail, and he's kind of like, looks like a raptor, and he's almost Asperger's because he's so smart. And he found the best company to build this sub.
One of my favorite things you said is for relaxation, he studies military history.
Yeah.
I was like, okay.
Speaks 7 languages, including Arabic. Was in naval intelligence doing, I forget what it was, like some crazy thing where they locked him in a room for, in Pearl Harbor, like trying to analyze stuff for 20 years. And he found this company in Florida called Triton Submarines, and I always refer to them as the Apple of submersible design. There aren't that many submersible companies, but Triton is just magnificent. And so he got the right group, and nobody thought there could be a full ocean-depth passenger submersible. It had been tried before. James Cameron tried it in 2012, and his submersible basically just started to disintegrate on the bottom of the Mariana Trench. He won't tell you that, but I'll tell you that. And I know people that were on the expedition, and 11 of his 12 thrusters failed. He couldn't go anywhere. There were cracks in it. It never dived again. Victor wanted one where he could take a scientist and it could dive repeatedly, safely, to the greatest depths that nobody had ever been to. And the great thing about Victor was that he brought all the top Hadal scientists along and bankrolled it all. Although Victor's not a billionaire, like he actually had some, as wealthy as he is, incurred quite a bit of personal risk.
Yeah.
And it was an expedition called the 5 Deeps. And so I actually just kind of got invited onto the 5 Deeps.
Awesome.
And it's just a massive stroke of luck. And also to be able to meet the top scientists in the Hadal zone. And also, I love scientists because they're so passionate about what they study. These scientists had dedicated their lives to studying this realm that they had never seen. And Victor started taking them down, and every dive was just this massive revelation. And so once that expedition was over, he decided to keep going. And so there was another expedition called Pacific Ring of Fire, and I got onto that one. And then at some point, I asked Victor very nervously, do you think I could maybe dive with you sometime? He knew I was writing a book. And he turned to me and said, sure, let's go to the Mariana Trench. and I won't do any spoilers, but so I got to do, as far as I know, I'm the only journalist that got to do this because Victor then couldn't really afford to keep the sub in the ship and sold it to it has a very happy ending because it was sold to a man named Gabe Newell, who was, I think, number 3 at Microsoft at one point. And Gabe is obsessed with the ocean and hired all the Hadal scientists and basically gave them the sub and the ship. So now that sub and ship just goes around the world doing science funded by a billionaire.
It's pretty awesome.
And sometimes people get really edgy when I mention this because, like, there's a Google, Eric Schmidt has a ship, Ray Dalio has a ship. And people think this is really awful, but the ocean needs, they have these resources and let's get them for the ocean. We need this.
100%.
Yeah, so, and to dive that deep is just extraordinary. It is, the best way I can say it is like, it's like meeting the earth for the first time. And it's awe. And it's, the ocean one of the things I love most about it is that it requires humility, a real true humility, because you really understand life from a different perspective. And I come back with as many details as I can so that I can share them with readers and we can all revel in this experience. But I will also say that if you ever have a chance to dive, first of all, make sure you're in a sphere. Has to be a sphere. That is the only shape that can withstand the pressures and distribute them equally.
Tell us about the egg.
The egg? Oh, well, they sent an egg down. An egg survived the Mariana Trench.
Outside, not inside the sphere, outside the
think
sphere.
of it. It's like if you take a sphere and you crush it, it just becomes stronger. If you step on a Coke can, you know what happens. The sphere is the shape, and all of these subs go through like a very expensive, very rigorous testing that's akin to the FAA, but much more involved, like more like NASA probably. Again, the only sub to have ever skipped that step was the Titan, and that's why the realm of manned submersibles has a 100% safety record outside of that tragedy. The only sub that would go to full ocean depth was Victor's sub until 2023, when the Chinese government created a 3-man sub. So there's only 2 of those in the world, and it just can't fail to change everything, like emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. It feels very serene, but also it's very serious. You know it's very serious. You can feel the gravitas of it, but it's serene. Yeah.
And you can feel it so well in the book, reading your words. It's such a beautiful experience. I hope everyone will read this book. Let's open up to questions. Does anyone have any questions for Susan? Oh, hi there.
Well, I'm just sort of, I'm sort of curious about, how much money it takes to, launch a rocket up into space. What is the comparison of a cost to create these submersible?
Good question,
yeah. Victor's submersible, they all need a mothership, so that adds the cost. And Victor's sub was, I think it cost about $80 million. And then there's the operations. Like for every hour they dive, they need about 2.5 hours, 3 hours of maintenance. And the environment is just unlike space. It's incredibly, the pressure. I mean, at the bottom of the Mariana Trench, the pressure is 20,000 pounds per square inch, which one person told me is the equivalent of 300 777s fully fueled stacked on top of it. So that is not an issue that you're going to have in space, and you need the same kind of a controlled life support system, because like a lot of the times people will say to me, well, how do you do you need a decompression stop on the way up? And it's like, no. That sphere has got to be unbreachable. That one is 4 inches of titanium in a perfect sphere. It has to be perfect. And I mean, the trouble that they go to build this, it's just such a feat of engineering. And to give you a sense of how, I mean, between 2012, when James Cameron became the 3rd man in history to go down to the bottom of the Mariana Trench, and between 1960, when 2 men for the first time, one from the Navy, one who was a Swiss physicist, went to the Mariana Trench in a craft called a bathyscaphe. Between then and 2012, when James Cameron went, that was 3 people. During that same time, something like 250 people went to the International Space Station. So it's a really, the engineering costs and problems caused by the salt water itself and the pressure, I think, make it more expensive I mean, there are 3 Mars rovers and 2 full ocean depth submersibles. So
yeah. And it's like almost all privately funded, which is just insane to me. Yeah,
the government doesn't fund any manned. Well, no, that's not true. The National Science, there's one sub that I dived in fairly recently called the Alvin. It's the U.S. Navy's research sub.
That's the one on the cover.
Yeah. And that's it, though. And scientists wait a really long time for that sub. It's the only sub that we have that does research. The other tools that they have are really capable too, like ROVs. They're really useful for certain things. They can take amazing they have fiber optic cables, so you can get you can send them into places that are too dangerous, perhaps, where, in a place where you might not be able to get a sub might get trapped or something. There are autonomous vehicles. We're living through a golden age of finding out what's down there, and
it's
science
incredible.
has everything to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
My concern would be, how did China get involved in this? Because that's my concern, would be what their reasoning or desires to do this, and it wouldn't be just empirical research.
Oh, you're quite right.
Yeah.
They're all about mining. It's a little bit like enervating to know that the U.S. Does not have any full ocean depth assets. China does now. And one time when Victor dived into one certain area of the Victor ended up diving 15 times into the Mariana Trench, into the Challenger Deep, which is the deepest spot, and took down 12 different people, including the first female scientists. And one thing that they found when they were down there, because nobody had been there, was a whole bunch of fiber optic cable that, and keep in mind, he was in Navy intelligence for 20 years, and he believes that the Chinese government is using some of their full ocean depth assets to put listening devices at depths that nobody else can find them, and that they knew that the sub was coming and would be traversing the trench, and so they cut the instruments and left the cables. Leaving cables as entanglements is one of the most dangerous. Subs don't implode, except for the Titan. Subs do not implode, but they get entangled in cables sometimes. So that was kind of crazy. And China has something like 10 ocean research vessels. And they also have 2 subs. One goes to 6,500 meters with 3 people, and the other one goes to, I think, 4,000 meters. So we have one 6,500 meter sub. They have one 11,000 meter sub, one 6,500 meter sub, and one 4,000 meter or 5,000 meter sub. And they have 10, they also have like a whole chain of ocean universities. They are playing the long game and investigating the deep ocean in a way that America is absolutely not doing. And I hope that changes.
Right, well, I was going to say, I'm hoping that even if our government isn't willing to fund, that they're being apprised of that and have the understanding of what the potential could be if they don't put that on their wish list or to-do list, that they need to. I mean, space travel is fine, but this is where we live.
That's
right. Exactly.
Oh man.
Yeah.
I don't
want to be behind China on anything related to our survivability here on Earth.
Quite right. And if something happened, one of the reasons we have the Alvin is because let me see if I get this right. Two U.S. planes, a B-52 bomber and an aerial refueling plane, collided over the Mediterranean, and a hydrogen bomb fell into the Mediterranean at a depth that and I think this happened in like the 50s. Don't quote me, but it's around that era. And there was no vehicle of any kind that could get this out, and you couldn't just leave it lying around there. So they created the Alvin. So we do have this one sub, and we have some pretty good ROVs. But the French have a 6,500 meter sub. The Japanese have a 6,500 meter sub. The only subs for the Hadal Zone are Victor's sub, which is now privately owned for scientists, and hasn't got the ability to do the heavy duty science work like installing instruments or recovering instruments. It's more of an observation and has a manipulator arm for taking samples of sediment and fauna. But like some of these subs, like the Alvin, it's like going down with a portable like garage. And the Chinese sub is so big, it travels with its own crew of 80 technicians.
It's crazy.
It's got a bathroom in it.
Yeah.
And believe me, they don't have bathrooms. And so, yeah, if anything happens below 6,500 meters, any of our assets, anything like that, we have no ability to get it. Not even an ROV. We don't, but Woods Hole is working on this, and they may have some ROVs soon, but it's an astonishing gap in security, I think. And especially when you consider that all of our information runs through seafloor cables. And there are hundreds and hundreds of seafloor cables, and those are incredibly easy to access if you can go down there and do it.
Right.
Yeah, so that's a very interesting point. Yeah, thank you.
And with that,
I think this gentleman.
Okay, one more question. Yes, sir.
It just seems hard to believe the Navy, with all of our submarine force, are not studying all this and have no motivation to do that. It seems incredible.
Well, they have Woods Hole and they have scripts, and yet it's the vehicles. And, you know, a submarine, we don't know exactly what depths the subs go to, but let's just say Russia had a sub that could go down to 20,000 feet. It was called the Losharik, and Russia had some very strange subs, and the Losharik was like a pearl necklace, so sphere, 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 sphere with tunnels between them. And it something happened to it. I think it caught on fire, and they all died. And of course, it was completely secret. It could be that the U.S. has some vehicles like that, but I think I would know about them, actually. I have some pretty good contacts, and it's a confirm or deny kind of thing, but the submarines can't go very deep. They really can't. Like, I would say 600. It's not a submarine thing. It's something else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I would just add on there, I'm retired from the Navy, but my feeling would be is it's not that the Navy's not interested, it's also a matter of funding.
Yeah.
And if you can't get that point across, because this is the first, I'm so glad I came, because I had no understanding of this at all. And this is serious. It feels very serious.
Totally agreed. It is very serious.
It's 95% of the planet. But Victor is a great emissary for this. You know, he's still, I guarantee you there are people in the Navy that he's debriefed. Yeah.
Well, please buy a book, get it signed by Susan. She's going to be in the back. And thank you.
She's going to be right here.
Oh, she's going to be signing up here.
Yeah.
Oh.
She was right there.
Okay.
All right. Can people get up here?
Thank you so much for coming.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you so much. Yeah.